Thank you. And thank you to Ariella and her work for hosting us today. Right, so for those I haven't met, my name's Jen Taylor Friedman. I am a scribe. I study scribes and I teach scribes. And with any luck, some of this will be helpful to at least some people. So the image on the left here is one that strikes fear into the heart of all my students. It is a section of the Mishnah Brura on the halachot of how to write the letter Zayin. And you can see he's got a diagram of Zayin with lots and lots and lots of points of interest labeled. Much, much, much halacha. And when you learn scribing, this is what you start out with. You have to master all of this. And this tends to lead people to the idea that this is the only way to write Zayin. So we're going to have a look at some other ways of writing letters from antiquity, from very early medieval, where all the scripts come from, Yemenite script and Sephardi script and some sorts of Ashkenazi script. So we're going to have a quick tour of that. We could spend a year doing all of this, but we're going to boil it down to 45 minutes. So of necessity, a lot of this is very simplified. Here we go. Torah scrolls. Our first real Torah scrolls that we can learn things from start coming up about the year 1000-ish. Before that, there are very few manuscripts. There's the Dead Sea Scroll cache, which goes up to about the year 200. And you can see you see my pointer? Yeah, okay, great. So here's some early Dead Sea Scroll. Here's some late Dead Sea Scroll. These are biblical manuscripts. And they don't look a lot like today's Torah scrolls, obviously. We're not going to spend a lot of time in antiquity, but some things to notice are the very heavy triangular serifs, the joined up hay here. Here in the early Dead Sea Scroll corpus, we still have the name of God in Paleo-Hebrew script, the early script that things used to be in before they were in the one we recognize today. So deciphering that can be very exciting, and I would love to give us 10 minutes just to decipher some Dead Sea Scrolls. But I strongly recommend finding them online and playing with them. But we're going to jump to the Engedi scroll, which is probably 3rd or 4th century according to the radiocarbon dating. And the Engedi scroll is magic because it's just a charred lump of burned parchment, but the magic of algorithms and of technology, burned parchment responds differently to some sorts of radiation than burned ink does. So they were able to unwrap it digitally and read what was in it, which is completely magic. And it's quite hard to do paleography on unwrapped digital burned scrolls, but some people have had a pretty good go. And the script is quite similar to a lot of the scripts in the Dead Sea cache. So that's antiquity. We have a pretty good idea what the antiquity scripts look like. And then there's this big gap with very few manuscripts in it. There's writing on pottery, and there's carvings and mosaics and inscriptions, but there's no biblical manuscripts, basically. There's a few papyrus fragments from later in antiquity. So these are from Egypt, and we still don't have a lot to go on. So no complete Torahs there, but they do give us an idea of what the very early Jews were doing with their script for their Torahs. But from the hidden period between when we have the Dead Sea manuscripts and when we have Torahs that we can actually identify today, there's the Gemara right smack in the middle of there. So we have no manuscripts from the period of the Gemara, but we have the Gemara. Thank you, Gemara. And what the Gemara has to say about script is really, really quite limited. So here's the relevant part from Masechet Shabbat. This is the earliest letter halacha we have, and it's quite simple. It says, when the Torah says Ktav Sta, which you recall it says in the Shema, Ktav Sta al mezuzot beitecha v'sharecha, write them on the doors of your houses and on your gates. So, Shete Ktiva Tama, says the Gemara, making wordplay. Ktav Tam. It's one word, but you can split it up into two words, Ktav and Tam. Tam is a word that means sort of simple or elegant or uncomplicated. Shelo yichtov alfin ayin, ayin alfin. Don't make aleph into ayins or ayins into alephs. Don't make bets into kafs or kafs into bets. Don't make gimels into tzadis or tzadis into gimels. Don't make dalits into rashis or rashis into dalits, hays into chetz, chetz into hays. Don't make vavs into yuds or yuds into vavs. Don't make zayins into nuns or nuns into zayins. And it goes on a bit. So it's concerned with stomping out ambiguity. What it's not saying like the Mishnah Berurah that you should have two sticky outy bits here and a bit that comes down from the middle, and that should be narrow at the top and wider in the middle and taper to a point at the bottom, and that it should have three tagine on top of it. It doesn't say any of this. What it's concerned with is just don't mix up letters. And when we come to the period of the Karaganiza, we've got some nice Torah fragments that we can look at. There's this one that's terribly burned up. There's some more fragments of this one, smaller ones in the Geniza. So people argue about the dating of this one, but probably relatively late in the scheme of things. And there's this other lovely sheet that the Library of Congress owns, which is another early one. We're going to zoom in on some of their scripts now. So what can we see?
On the top two, the cuff is still joined. The leg of the cuff is still joined to the roof of the cuff. It's not yet separate.
Crazy, isn't it? Yeah, joined up cuff here, where the leg is quite happily joined to the roof. And let's look at hay and chet as well, because on the top one, the one from the Geniza, the leg of hay is basically attached to the roof. And if we went back and looked at the fragment closely, we would see that quite a lot of his hays are attached. Some of them are not attached, many of them are. And it can be awfully difficult to tell the difference between a hay and a chet in the early scripts. We get a bit later, the leg of the hay has become detached, which helps us tell the difference. Flat-topped chet all through. And the one from the Geniza on the top row has these very exuberant serifs, great big curly things. And this funny little triangle / diamondy thing on the top of shin there. The middle of shin's not attached to the vertical. That's something that I wouldn't let any of my students get away with today. And then over here we can see Aleph makes this triangle shape where the leg is attached right at the very end of the diagonal. A little bit later on, we've got a bit more of a spitz up at the top there above the leg. And that's going to develop into something we recognize later. But look at the way Aleph is bending his leg forward here. That's a bit more muted in the later one. So we've got a bit of a progression from this earlier one with its huge serifs and kind of spiky look to something that's a bit more sober. We don't have great contrast between horizontals and verticals because these are all reed scripts, all written with reeds. And the latest one here, the National Library identifies it as Yemenite, but it doesn't say why it's Yemenite. So people say it's Yemenite. I'm going to roll with that. And we're going to look at some Yemenite scripts. Here are some more Yemenite manuscripts. The one on the left here, I boosted the contrast a bit so that we can see it. Then there's one that's perhaps 15th century, perhaps a bit later. And there's one from a contemporary Yemenite. And the fun thing about these is they're quite varied. They all have this aleph that Ashkenazim today wouldn't like, because again, he's bending his knee forward. In the middle range one, it's somewhat difficult to tell the difference between bet and calf. In the top one, it's well, also difficult-ish. The modern Yemenite here has his cuff joined because he thinks that's all right. I'm told he has a reputation for being a bit of a weirdo, but he's a from guy and he cares about stuff, and he's writing his cuff joined up, so there you go. Notice that none of them have any tugging on shin, as we might expect today. And again, our modern weirdo is not writing with a humpy chet like we might expect him to have. He's writing with a flat chet. He's doing that deliberately to be a bit historical, but can see him doing it. He is a legit person to be doing this. So I'm going to jump into Spain, because this is where Torahs really start getting fun. So here we've got a lump of the Bologna scroll, and the Bologna scroll is important because it's the oldest known complete Torah scroll. It does a number of things that we wouldn't expect a Torah scroll to do, including using space filler. See at the end of his line here, he does this a fair bit throughout the scroll, just puts in a little bit of filler so that you know that this isn't a break, it's just, I didn't have enough letters to fill up the line. And he can do that because that's what he's doing. So the scroll has been radiocarbon dated to strong probability of the early 13th century, and paleographic analysis bears that out. So the way you do paleographic analysis in this period is you get other manuscripts, such as books, which often very helpfully have colophons in the front of them. And the colophons say things like, I, the scribe, wrote this in such a place on such a date. And then that gives you a data point that you can nail down. So then you can compare other manuscripts, which is mostly how this sort of dating tends to work. And then you can place things. So this one is mostly similar to this one that was in this period with this place. And you can match it up. And then radiocarbon dating also helps a lot, of course. So the next one we've got is one that's presently held in the Biblioteca Palatina in Parma. And it's a late 13th century one. And we know that because it's basically identical to one that got sold in a private collection and was radiocarbon dated. So this one's much more what you'd expect from classic Sephardi. Note here it's got a gap. It has gaps between each verse. The Bologna scroll has that too, if I recall correctly. So that's quite a common thing in older Torahs, to have just a nice handy gap between the verses. Anybody who reads Torah knows how useful that can be, so you know when to stop reading. The other thing we should note here is how it's got a little word parked in above the line. You don't see that much anymore, but that's a completely legitimate way of making a correction. If you're missing a letter or a word, just pop it in above the line. It tends to confuse laners, so we tend not to do it anymore, but it is legitimate. And then we have the development of this script in Amsterdam, because, of course, the expulsion from Spain caused lots and lots of Jews to be scattered all over the place. Many of them ended up in Amsterdam, and they took their script with them. So you see the Spanish script developing in Italy and bits of Europe. So here we are zooming in on some of the scripts from Sephard. At the top here, we've got the Library of Congress sheet, the 10th, 11th century Oriental one, just for comparison purposes, because that's where the Spanish scripts grew out of, the Oriental script. So you can see they keep quite a lot of similarities. The lovely bendy-legged aleph. In the Oriental script, it's very exuberant, and in the later scripts, it's calmed down a bit, but it's still got this characteristic bending forward and then just spitzing out a little bit on its toes. And the serifs calm down a little bit. So up here, there's bendy serif on kaf and a little bit on bet. And it's still there, just a tiny bit more up here. Here it's turned into something slightly different. But again, you can see the development there. And look also at the way the base of the letter slants here in the earlier scripts. The base of kaf there and the base of kaf on these. Just a little bit slanty. And then that calms down in early modern, goes to being nice and horizontal. You can see the way that the hump of chet develops, that early chet isn't humped at all. And later chet, okay, now we're getting a little humpy, or we've got a little antenna. And then later script, definitely this triangle. And we see that that's responding to concerns in the Gemara that the chet should be humped. Not totally clear what that means in terms of the ancient scripts, but post-medieval scripts interpret it as having the triangle here. And
Jen,
it seems
question.
medieval. Yeah. Question, yeah.
Yeah, is the little antenna on the end of the bet and the chet and the hey and the kuf, is that a tag or is that a serif?
It depends how you want to talk about it. When you're talking about it, you have to define your terms quite carefully. So this guy, all his bets have this. So it's just a background feature of the letter. So I think we might call it a serif. On the other hand, then what are you going to call this guy on half? Because this is a ball with a stick with a little ball on it. So maybe we should call it a tag. But then we might want to define what a tag is. So we'll be precise about terms and we can call it a tag serif. I could go on at length boringly about tags, but we won't do that right now. But they're on all his letters. So that's just how he does them. And we've detached kuf by the later time. Bologna is the second one here, the orangey one. He doesn't join up his shin either. He does that pretty consistently in the scroll. He just doesn't care because that's not a consideration at his time. Today, if one of my scribes doesn't attach their shins, I tell them off and I say, you attach those shins. But back in the early 13th century, that just doesn't seem to have been something that bothered people. And again, later on, we get the tagging on shin, the 3 tagging that you would expect as a contemporary person. We've still got this flat bottom. You see flat bottom here, flat bottom here. This one's sort of slanty, but they're not the same shape as the ones we'll see a little bit later. And we've got some more Sephardim from North Africa. We've got an early modern North African scroll. And the reason we think it's early modern North African partly has to do with the layout and partly has to do with asking somebody who really specializes in early modern. So this one's not been radiocarbon dated, but various things about it make it look pretty old, but not very, very old. And there's a piece over here of a Megillah from the late 19th century. Megillot are really helpful for dating scrolls because often Megillot have illustrations. And often the illustrations, you can talk to art historians and art historians can say, aha, yes, that is an illustration from the late 19th century. So even though it may not have a date on it, the artwork can help you place a scroll relatively accurately, which is super helpful because the way people are writing Megillahs and the way people are writing Torahs is similar. They have the same set of rules. They have the same set of everything, pretty much. So what you've got for a Megillah, you can probably apply to a Torah fairly confidently. So although this is a chunk of a Megillah, we can probably say that Torahs from that period look the same. So North Africa. Again, I'm bringing the Oriental script for comparison and the one we just saw from Amsterdam. And then here we can see these ones have the flat chets. The kufs aren't joined, but the shins are joined now. So we're developing that way. One thing we should look at in early modern and pre-modern scripts. See here with this kaf, how his back comes down and round, and then his foot extends really cozily up to the next letter. So this is nesting when letters get cozy. You don't see it so much now, but you see it a lot in earlier manuscripts. And it's a sweet thing to look out for. And when I hound my students through the Ktav Sta talks about this occasionally as well. It confuses moderns because we never see it, but this is a thing that you get. Here's another bit of it with the chet. You can see that the right leg of chet is a little bit shorter to accommodate the foot of probably tav there. So the letters all have this nice sort of snuggly relationship with each other, which is something that you don't necessarily find today. Now I'm going to jump us into Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz is a fun place to be because there's lots and lots of variation. Sephardic scripts are still, if not actually written with a quill, written with a quill to imitate, if not written with a reed. They're originally reed scripts. I think in Europe they turn into quill scripts, but they're still written to imitate reed script. So they have fairly even horizontals and verticals. Not a great deal of contrast. But when you get into Ashkenaz, they're using quills like crazy. And they're really enjoying what you can do with quills. So their scripts have a lot of play between thick horizontals and thin verticals, which is a thing you can do with quills when you're writing, because a quill can take a very thin edge where a reed can't always. So here we've got the Biela scroll, which is owned by a community in Biela, and it's interesting because it's the oldest scroll that's currently in use by a community. They don't use it a lot because it's so old, but they use it for special occasions. And that's really nifty. And you can see it also has these exciting modified letters, which we talked about a few weeks ago. I like his ones because his pays look like little penguins. He has some fairly serious nesting going on as well. Look down here. Under ayin like that. Tav gets very cozy with the next letters. And something that you see in medieval Ashkenaz, but not so much elsewhere. Final pay here looks suspiciously like tav. You might think that that was an accident, but that's just how final pay works at some times and places. So here's tav over here. His back leg is considerably shorter. Final pay's leg is a good bit longer, but not nearly as long as you might expect. And that's just how final pay goes in 13th century France. Then over here, we've got one of the Erfurt scrolls. We can date the Erfurt scrolls because the community of Erfurt was destroyed in a pogrom in 1349, and all of its manuscripts were seized, which is obviously not a great thing from the perspective of the community, but historians find it quite useful because it means nobody's been using those manuscripts since. They were just sitting in the library in Berlin mostly, where they were seized. So they've been snapshotted in time from 1349. So we know this is a German type of scroll. German scrolls are a good bit less exuberant than the French ones. See, the French ones have these variations in width, the sort of diamond shapes on many of the verticals. And the German scrolls do have that, just a bit less so. And the French ones have these fishtail effects at the tops of the horizontal strokes, at the ends of the horizontal strokes. Like here, little concave bits. And the German scrolls, again, they sort of have that, but it's much more restrained. And then here's a scroll from 15th century Poland. And everything I know about this comes from the Sotheby's report because it was auctioned by Sotheby's. I don't know who owns it now. But here again, you can see really clearly the gaps between words at the ends of the pasuk. And you can see his quite peculiar kuf. He's got lots of modified letters. See these lovely ayins down here. And he's got crazy, crazy serif-y, taggy things. Are they taggy? Are they serifs? I don't know. Whatever you want to call them. He's got lots and lots and lots of them. So we can look in a bit closer on some of his letters. Early Ashkenaz, it's often really hard to tell the difference between, say, bet and kaf. Particularly in, look at this guy here. You're reading through him and you really have to know what you're writing, what you're reading, because the difference is awfully subtle. And as time goes on, we start to make that distinction a little bit clearer, much to the relief of all concerned, I'm pretty sure. And again, we see in early Ashkenaz, okay, here, chet and hey are backwards in the table, that's my bad. This one's the chet, this one's the hey. Sorry about that. But you can see there's barely any difference except this tiny, tiny, tiny gap separating the leg of the hay from the roof. Fortunately, we start differentiating a bit harder by putting the hump back onto the chet. And then chet develops into two zayins down here. Again, this is partly in response to a sugya in the Gemara, I think, which I'm not going to get into now, but it has to do with concerns about interpreting the Gemara and making your script match what's in the Talmud. Kuf develops in a funny way in parts of Ashkenaz, with this really pronounced bend round to the right. And then I brought Zayin as well now, so that we can see Zayin and Shin and such letters really start to get the three tagin that you would expect. But here in Ashkenaz, we've got these lovely round shins now. And you can see how that developed from the Oriental script, because when you're writing it, you take the left-hand stroke down, and then it swoops up again. Possibly it's two downward strokes, downwards, and then swooping down. But what you get is almost a curve here at the base. And then in Ashkenaz, that swooping motion really comes into its own, swoop up like that, to give you a very rounded base. And here too, round, wee. And here still it's a little less rounded, but there's still definitely a round feel to it, which we did not get in Sepharad at all. So that's quite characteristic and somewhat unexpected. And then those develop into later Ashkenazic scripts. And I'm not laying out the exact succession of development, partly because modern script isn't my speciality yet, and partly because it's super complicated and it would take several months. But these are all very characteristic Ashkenazi kind of feel. This one's a scroll that was identified by inscriptions on the handles. That's a really helpful thing that you sometimes find. So infrequently, but it's glorious when it does happen. And you can make out the date and sometimes even the place, occasionally the donor if you're very lucky. So here we've got fishtails again, quite restrained fishtails, but there they are. Little hairline serifs like we had earlier in Ashkenaz. The tagin on shin and tet and the related letters are starting to, sometimes he does really lovely, big assertive ones, and sometimes they're just little hairline strokes. That's just a peculiarity of this scribe. He's not totally consistent with them. Who knows why? I don't think that's an artifact of later correction, because I worked on that scroll up close and you could tell. And here's a 19th century Eastern European Megillah that Again, looks very Gothic-y, very Ashkenazi. And now the shins have become terribly pointed. So that's a whole thing. And here's another scroll from 20th century America, because again, this is a product of Jewish diasporas shifting around. When you had lots and lots of Jews coming away from Europe and coming to America and bringing their scripts with them. So you can have a German-ish flavor of script or a Central European-ish flavor of script, but now it's American. And the effects of that haven't really been studied at all yet. But that's a whole thing that we have to take into account, that when people move to a new place, they have a different set of visual inputs, and that's going to affect how their scripts work. So let's compare here. We've got the 15th century Polish script for comparison again. And now down here in Bohemia, we've got some things that still feel a little bit Sephardic. We remember that with the Sephardic Aleph, the left leg was like a knee bending forward with toes. This doesn't bend forward, but it's still got that little forwards pointing kind of toe here, right at the corner. And that's something that they seem to be picking up from Sephardi script, which is knocking around that area, which is curious. But for the other Ashkenazi scripts, there's much more of a come down, go left, go right. Sometimes you get a little sticking out bit on the left-hand corner of Aleph's foot. Sometimes you don't. That's one of the things that characterizes Arizal script, which is a whole different kettle of fish. But so Ashkenaz starts to get complex because it's got tons of halachists, all being neurotic, all writing down exactly what they think that they should see. And then later halachists coming along, reading what the previous halachists had to say, trying to incorporate that into their script, whilst also being aware of other halachists that they had access to. So later Ashkenazic script becomes almost hyper-aware of halacha in a really complicated way that, again, I haven't studied enough yet, but I don't think you could ever study it enough, honestly. But you can see the progression here between the 15th century Ashkenazic script and the modern ones. The way that Aleph's diagonal starts to get this little dancing feel to it, which it didn't have in earlier scripts. Sometimes it becomes easier to tell the difference between kaf and bet, sometimes not quite so much. In the halacha that I teach my students, it's more like this guy here, where kaf is very roundy, bet is very not roundy. But in other scripts still, sometimes bet is roundy a little bit on top. And that's a Sephardic influence, but in Ashkenazic communities. We've got humpy chet consistently now. That's just become standard. We've got still lots of these lovely serifs. Sometimes they're just hairline serifs, and sometimes they're ball and stick serifs that look like tagin. And we can call them tagin if we want. We've got this lovely shape on the kuf that develops into almost a little zayin.
In the pocket of my vest. You're sitting right by it, right there.
And in zayin, that becomes this lovely diamond shape. That's also a later Ashkenaz thing. You can see in the early Ashkenazi ones, zayin is just a little poke down, a little straight stick. But aesthetics dictates that it develops like this diamond. And then halacha notices that this is how it's generally done, writes down that this is how it's done, and then it becomes part of the halachic canon. So when you read the Mishnah Berurah on how to make zayin, as you do today, that's what you learn, that zayin must be narrow at the top, narrow at the bottom, thick in the middle. But it was not always so. And when you read the Mishnah Berurah today, he emphasizes that it's extremely important to bring your shin to a point at the bottom. And you can see how that's developed from the earlier Ashkenazi shape. That earlier it went down, and then up again. And some Ashkenazi scripts we saw just took the curving motion there and curved it so that the bottom of shin was curved. But in another direction, you could take the downward stroke and then emphasize the difference between that and the upward stroke. And that's what's happened down here. Downward, change direction, upward. And that gives you the point. So some script families took the basic shape and emphasized the curvy nature, and others emphasized the pointy nature. And then so you get two quite different feels of letter, but they're both coming from the same basic shape, which was laid down much earlier. So an earlier halachist might not have emphasized what exactly was going on there at the bottom of shin, and some will have taken it in one direction, just copying the script that they saw in front of them, and made something with a broader, curvier kind of base, and others went much more pointy. So there's a ton of different ways of writing the letters, and they're all kosher according to some community somewhere. So I teach students the halachot of Mishnah Berurah, but I try and emphasize that there are so many other ways of writing. And you can choose one and work with it. If you're going to try and write like a 2nd century Dead Sea Scroll person, you might want to be aware that nobody else in your community will share that aesthetic, so they won't like your writing. But if you're writing like somebody who had Spanish Portuguese ancestors, not looking at anyone in particular here, and you're in a community that values the aesthetic of a Spanish Portuguese script, then you can write like that. It won't match the halacha of the Mishnah Berurah, but it will jibe with the aesthetics and traditions of a particular community. And this is legit. So you might have seen these. I'm just going to put this in here because I'm always on about these. Cheap mezuzahs, very cheap mezuzahs that you buy for $20 on Amazon. So apparently I just said that basically anything goes in the way of letter shapes, but not anything goes. So when you're writing letter shapes, you got to work in somebody's tradition. And this sort of thing, I think, is not written in any tradition except the tradition of making a quick buck. So if you could find the writer of a mezuzah like this and say, whose tradition are you working in? Tell me about the history of this script. If they could give you a coherent answer, great, mazel tov. But if they want to tell you that this is 21st century Ashkenazic script, then that's just not right. So you need some continuity, either halachic continuity or visual continuity, that when you're writing, you've got to be connected to something. And I don't think this is it. So that's the difference I make, that you can write like a 15th century Sepharad all you want, and you can write Temani all you want. You can write like a crazy Yemenite who lives in Yerushalayim and joins up his cuffs to his roof, because you're doing it in line with a tradition that you can point to. You can say, this is how I'm writing. But if your tradition is, I need to write as fast as I can because I've got to sell this for $20, that's less okay. Because there are so many beautiful ways to write Torahs, and you can choose any one of them. So all of these are kosher according to somebody. And it's not just the 3 script families that they tell you exist. The Beit Yosef, the Arizal, and the Sephardic. It's what you can buy now, but there's so much more to it than that. And they're all so beautiful. And if anybody wants me to give them pictures of these so you can learn them, please tell me. So that's what I've got to say about that. Did I miss anything important that people want to know?
I guess I have a question.
Yay.
Thank you
Nice
so
to
much
meet you.
for having me. Rabbi Motzkin invited me, and I'm so interested in Judaica and the work that you're doing, and I'm so excited to learn about Torahs in the middle of the day. So my question for you is, over time, as you're looking at these scripts, are you noticing a change in size as well as shape and style, or is size pretty consistent over time?
Oh, that's such a good question. There's not nearly as much variation as there is with other types of manuscripts, let's say. Some scripts tend to be a bit bigger than others. Like often the Czechoslovakian ones of the sort of 18th century are really quite large. But Torahs run pretty much of a muchness in size. So there's not that much variation in the script. It's not like when you get an Italian Siddur that's got teeny tiny script and you can tell it's Italian because it's teeny tiny. I don't think there's that kind of variation. Torahs are a bit sort of flatter in that respect. But you do get mezuzah script, of course, which is inherently tiny. And you do get tiny little Torahs that are written to be tiny little Torahs, to be portable, or just as sort of showpieces, like a Torah that's yay big. So you get those, but there isn't the same kind of variation that you get with other manuscripts. That's one of the things that makes Torahs tricky.
Cool, thank you.
Yay. Oh, and one thing is that today people are starting to do the special letters again, which is super exciting because they don't look very halachic and they confuse people who have strictly halachic mindsets. But look at this lovely vav here. He's one of the special vavs, and here's a special pay, and a different kind of special pay, and a particular kind of special ayin. And people are starting to do those again as well, because we're starting to loosen up a little bit and realize that, oh, these aren't like what the Mishnah Berurah describes, but they're part of a whole legitimate script tradition. And they're real and they mean things. And people are reconnecting with that, which is fabulous.
I have a question about that, Jen. So folks that are starting to use special letters, how does that jive with what you said a few minutes ago about basing yourself in a single tradition that can be recognized as a tradition? I mean, are folks that are using special letters kind of pulling stuff from just here, there, and everywhere because it's cool?
I don't think you have to base yourself in one tradition exactly, but you have to be able to point to how you got where you got where you are. How you got where you are. But people have used the special letters in all the script branches. Like Yemenites are really consistent about it. And they're a thing in Sfarad, they're a thing in Italy, they're a thing in Ashkenaz. And so whatever kind of tradition you're writing in, it's okay to wake up that part of your tradition that's sleeping, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, you could take it the other way and say, well, nobody does this, so we shouldn't do it either. But I do think that's a bit of a boring approach.
Well, I love the idea of having all of this stuff to draw upon. I think it's just so cool. Thank you so much for offering us this lecture, Jen.
It's tremendously rich, and then people like you take it away and do things with it. And
no, I'm trying to write a Torah that will be recognized as kosher and not out there and weird. Although I have fantasies about when I finish the Torah that will be recognized as kosher and not out there and weird, of writing a second one that will be like in, antiquity script that nobody's doing now, just because I can.
I'll send you a tikkun from a zuzah from the 14th century that's super weird.
Oh, I would love that.
Write that.
I would love that, Jen.
Yay.
So fun.
I'll do that later.
Great.
Yay. Right. Did we stop recording yet? No, we didn't. Let's stop recording.